moving right along. Our next speaker is Sara Tarter, is a final year doctoral student in history of art at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, of course. Her research focuses on the sale, display, and circulation of art in French, British, and American department stores in the late 19th and early 20th century. In 2016, she attended the Terra Foundation Summer Residency in Giverny as a doctoral fellow. She also has co-published an article in the journal Fashion, Style, and Popular Culture on a visitor research study conducted on the Victoria and Albert Museum exhibition Hollywood Costume. That sounds like fun. Since 2015, she has been a member of the Association for Art History Student Group, which organizes conferences and other events for the history of art students at institutions across the UK. Currently, she is the lead organizer of the next New Voices postgraduate research conference to be held at the University of Birmingham on January 11, 2018, on the topic of art and movement. And her topic this afternoon is the language of the brush and the language of money, John Wanamaker and the intersections of collecting and commerce. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Am I on? Yes, okay. On March 4th, 1881, John Wanamaker opened a commercial art gallery in his eponymous department store, which was then, as now, located on Philadelphia's Market Street, although today it is, of course, run under the Macy's rather than the Wanamaker's name. This opening followed earlier ones at European retailers, including the 1875 opening of Parisian department store Au Bon Marché's famed Galerie de Tableau, but Wanamaker's gallery was in fact the first in an American department store. Wanamaker's art gallery was thus the first step in a long and rich formal relationship between American department stores and fine art, which was especially consequential in what concerned the importation and display of European fine art. Moreover, Wanamaker's was arguably the most dynamic and impressive of all the American stores in its displays of art, making it a key case study in the motivations and realities behind department store art display in America. Going a layer deeper, it is apparent that John Wanamaker himself was responsible for much of this dynamism, for he was strident in his conviction that fine art and the department store belonged together for the greater good of both. I don't know what everyone thinks about that, but that was his belief. To this crusade, he lent his own attentions and, of course, his collection of European paintings by Europe's most famous artist of the time. Wanamaker's stridency begs the question of what reasons, beyond enhanced publicity and sales for his store, may have spurred him to commit so much time and money to the cause of fine art and its exposure to the American public. This paper will explore exactly this question via the early history of Wanamaker's art collection in the period between 1887 and 1893. This will include discussion of an intended store gallery for his art collection, which he planned to open in 1887. It will also consider Wanamaker's time as Postmaster General in the administration of President Benjamin Harrison from 1888 until 1892, and his use of fine art generally, and his collection particularly, to further his own commercial interest, which specifically meant the softening of the strong support for protectionist import tariffs in the Republican Party. Both examples show how Wanamaker was willing and able to wield fine art as a tool in the promotion of cultural and economic cosmopolitanism, two principles that were intimately tied to the success of his business through its trade in globally sourced products. While Wanamaker's own rhetoric about his store and his store's art-based initiatives tended toward the florid, a close analysis of his actions and even some of his earlier statements shows the practical and commercial considerations which necessarily foregrounded his activities. As a Wanamaker's advertisement stated in reference to the 1881 opening of the store's art gallery, the integration of fine art into the specific commercial system of the department store had the power to translate the, quote, language of the brush into the language of money. I am not contending that Wanamaker wished art to lose its mystique, much of which is predicated on its separation from commodities. In fact, department stores very often borrowed art's innate aura to in turn borrow a phrase from Walter Benjamin to sell their industrial products. What I am stating is that a canny businessman like Wanamaker, even factoring into his own evident personal appreciation of art and his interest in its power to culturally legitimize his fortune, would invariably also employ it as a mutable tool in his ultimate goal to sell the world, whether this meant selling goods from around the world or selling to everyone in the world. I think he was happy with both. Art was not just something that could be sold via his gallery or something that did the selling via his store's displays, but also something that could facilitate the expansion and smooth running of his business by creating an environment that was receptive to it. This paper will thus show how, in the time of great upheaval that was the late 19th century, Wanamaker used his art collection to direct both policy and sentiment towards cultural and economic change, but most importantly, toward his own commercial ends. So now getting into a bit of the history. Although Wanamaker opened his store's commercial gallery in 1881, his own most vigorous period of art collecting began after this point. Significantly, Wanamaker's business before this period was far from the stable empire we now consider it. He only bought and began to transform the building that would become his department store, an old railway depot in the then underdeveloped uptown area of Philadelphia, in 1874, and it took him until 1877 to begin to sell women's wear, which is the linchpin of the department store business. The opening of the store's art gallery, as well as the furniture business which accompanied it, and really a department store, the evolution to the department store is defined by starting to sell furniture, so it's really becoming a department store at this time, signified the solidification of its dry goods trade, which then allowed it to expand into other areas of merchandise. With his business ticking along and a highly experienced team headed by Robert C. Ogden to help him run it in his absence, Wanamaker could turn some of his attentions to other interests, for instance, art collecting and politics. As the Henry Clay Frick scholars here will know, Wanamaker joined Frick for a portion of his trip to Europe in the summer of 1887. Wanamaker and Frick had business interests in common, as Wanamaker was a major supplier to the general stores on Frick's western Pennsylvania minefields. Frick also contributed $20,000 to the Harrison campaign in 1887, for which Wanamaker was the finance manager. They also shared a fierce dislike of unionized labor and favored what might be termed enlightened capitalism to alleviate societal ills. In many ways, both men came into their own in the 1880s, with their business interest in art collecting coalescing at almost the same time. Their taste in art also reflected each other's, as well as the greater collecting practices of the time, although as we're seeing, they were also quite diverse. In the 1880s and 90s, Wanamaker and Frick both stocked what would become their immense collections with works by the most popular European salon artists of the time, including Meyer von Bremen and Tito Lessi. Wanamaker's most famous purchase was Hungarian artist Mihály Munkácsi's large-scale religious painting Christ Before Pilate, which he acquired in February 1887. Much has been written about this painting, including its importance to the religious movements of the period and its connection to one of the era's most infamous art dealers, Charles Sedlmayr. Coverage of this topic in my thesis focuses on Wanamaker's decision to tour the painting across the United States, as Sedlmayr had toured it across Europe. Yet the tour was not, in fact, Wanamaker's first plan for the painting. Originally, it was meant to be the crowning glory of a store art gallery, a fact revealed in a statement that Sedlmayr gave to the American press, and this is that statement. While Sedlmayr's statement was in all likelihood meant as a bit of self-promotion, the details he revealed about the gallery sparked public interest at the time and are today tantalizing clues into Wanamaker's intentions for his collection. And in this statement, Charles Sedlmayr goes in, but I didn't include it, a bit about the art that he's selling Wanamaker at this time. He was really Wanamaker's main dealer. Ogden, Wanamaker's second in command, also alluded in the press to plans to exhibit the painting for all of Philadelphia, including, crucially, its working classes. It seems that Wanamaker intended Pilate to form the nucleus of a kind of store museum, a separate display space for his collection that was adjacent to the store and crucially free to enter. If this space had materialized, it would have been an indisputable boon for Philadelphia's art-going public. Before the acquisition and display of the Wilstack collection in 1892 by the then Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Art, there was, as I understand it, and I should say I am very happy to be corrected on this because I know the experts are here today, few permanent display spaces for contemporary or Old Master European paintings in Philadelphia. As Stephen Kahn outlines, the Pennsylvania Museum was founded on the model of the South Kensington Museum. The museum's focus on industrial and decorative art served Philadelphia's industrial economy, but it left a gap in its art display landscape compared to cities like New York and Boston, which Wanamaker's gallery could have helped to fill. Ultimately, the gallery for Wanamaker's collection did not materialize at this time. Yet, despite the deviation in Wanamaker's plans, it is possible to imagine what his gallery would have looked like. In my opinion, Wanamaker was basing his vision on retailer A.T. Stewart's personal art gallery and his collection, which went up for auction after the death of his widow Cornelia Stewart in February 1887. It is well known how much Wanamaker admired Stewart, who he considered the founder of the modern American retail trade. Wanamaker even went so far as to buy Stewart's Iron Palace for the New York outlet of his store, which he opened in 1896. Stewart was a keen art collector, with perhaps his most famous acquisition, Rosa Bonheur's The Horse Fair. And in this image of Stewart's home, yes, that is it. In this image of Stewart's home gallery, you can see the painting prominently displayed on the far wall, circled there. Wanamaker did not attend the auction himself, but he did send a representative, a young Charles M. Kurtz, to the sale with instructions to buy anything that, quote, buy anything that seems cheap enough, end quote. Yet, despite Wanamaker's apparent attempt to mold his business and his collection on Stewart's, he was stepping beyond the older retailer's example and plans to exhibit art for his customers. Like all of New York's quote-unquote carriage trade department stores, a designation that also included Arnold Constable & Co. and Benjamin Altman, A.T. Stewart never allowed a gallery in his store for either the sale or display of art. Wanamaker's store was obviously of a different breed, which even Wanamaker himself admitted when, while comparing the two stores, he states that Stewart's had quote, limited itself to dry goods of the higher class. Wanamaker's and other large department stores which blossomed during the era, notably Macy's, Abraham and Straus, Gimbel's, and, under Harry Gordon Selfridge's influence, Marshall Field's, were pioneering what would become the mass market in both the products they sold and the customers they intended to reach. Crucially, these stores were also those which committed considerable resources to the sale and display of fine art. The discussed gallery would not be Wanamaker's last attempt to bring European art to the people of Philadelphia. You can see an example here. After his stint as Postmaster General, Wanamaker ramped up his efforts with annual importations of art from the Paris salons, for which his stores became even more famous. In the meantime, Wanamaker moved his collection to the place where it could arguably make the most impact, Washington, D.C. Wanamaker had long held political ambitions, and for years before he became Postmaster General, was touted as a prospective Republican senator for Pennsylvania or mayor of Philadelphia. Yet while Wanamaker was undoubtedly one of the most prominent and influential late 19th century Republicans, his politics was more ambiguous than his position might indicate. In fact, he often appealed to Democrats as much as Republicans, which is reflected in the fact that disaffected independent Republicans and canny Democrats conspired through clandestine midnight meetings to elect him mayor on a cross-party ticket in early 1887. It's complicated politics. Wanamaker ultimately declined the offer, yet two issues did indeed stand him at odds with the larger Republican Party: his opposition to the Bosch politics and corruption that haunted it, and its uncompromising stance towards import tariffs, which necessarily complicated his retail trade. While Wanamaker largely towed the party line in terms of rhetoric on the latter, his business interests often betrayed him. Historian Stephen Skowronek has stated in reference to Wanamaker's ambitions that he was a, quote, merchant who had no special interest in the protectionist policies that attracted industrial capital to the Republican Party. Although Wanamaker could not challenge the party's position on tariffs directly, he could still, through his position as Postmaster General, shape the country's economic and cultural outlook. My argument is that Wanamaker did not just do this through policy, but also through the display of his art collection, which he had moved from Pennsylvania to his personal residence in Philadelphia. Compared to the White House with its neoclassical architecture and staid nobility, Wanamaker's house on I Street burst with bric-a-brac and European flair. Photographer Frances Benjamin Johnston spent much of her early career in Washington, D.C., and, as part of a series on the homes of Washington politicians for DeMorris Family Magazine, did a photo story on Wanamaker's house. The article goes into great detail about the objects and art in the house, but also describes its key social function for Washington society. Like William C. Whitney, who occupied the house before him and served as Secretary of the Navy under Grover Cleveland, Wanamaker assumed the role of social organizer for the Harrison administration. The center of this activity was the house's grand ballroom, about which Johnston stated, "This room is the far-famed ballroom added by Secretary Whitney, and there is hardly an interior in Washington more talked about or oftener described than this same handsome apartment. With good reason, too, for with its rich decoration, wealth of artistic treasures, and frequent assemblages of notable people, it has always been one of the most famous salons of the capital." While Wanamaker retained much of the house's furnishings from Whitney's time, he brought with him the 50 paintings that adorned its walls. With the furniture arranged salon style, the Washington, D.C. elite, which often included President Harrison himself, would gather in rooms decorated with the most fashionable European art money could buy. And this is, hung beside the main entrance to the ballroom cum picture gallery, and that's right there, for instance, was one of William Bouguereau's prized religious paintings depicting the Virgin and Child being serenaded by angels. And that's the painting right there. Although Wanamaker did not bring Christ before Pilate to Washington, he did bring a smaller painting by Munkachi called After the Wedding, and you can see it right there. This John Racine was a typical and much sought-after work by the artist, who was celebrated as much for these paintings as for his large-scale religious canvases. Works by the likes of Millet, Corot, Daubigny, Jules Breton, Alma Tadema, and Détail were among the others hung in the picture gallery and elsewhere in the house. Many of these paintings were quintessential examples of each artist's work, and together made the house into a veritable museum of all that was great and good in Europe's salons and art schools over the preceding 30 years. You can see, besides this plethora of contemporary European painting, the influence of Stuart's collection can be seen directly in a watercolor by Rosa Bonheur entitled After the Horse Fair, which was hung in the house's dining room. So that's right up there. And I think I need a better picture of this, and there are better pictures in the Frances Benjamin Johnston archive, so I can see exactly which this is. I think it might be at the Cleveland Museum of Art, although I can't be sure because I can't see it well enough. The decoration of Wanamaker's house would have marked him as both modern and cosmopolitan to the politicians who visited it. Further, given Wanamaker's position in the administration and the importance of his house as a social center, I think it is possible that both he and his house influenced a rare softening towards one of the most controversial policies of the era, the Art Tariff. This tax, which was levied on foreign imported paintings, was unique in the Western world and considered a scourge by American art collectors. Perhaps astonishingly, given the amount of ire directed towards the tariff, the Harrison administration was the only Republican government in the period from 1861 to 1909 to see this controversial tariff lowered. The Tariff Act of 1890, which otherwise raised import taxes across the board, halved the art tariff from 30 to 15%, and the president himself even advocated for the tariff's complete abolition. While it is unclear exactly how much sway Wanamaker held over Harrison, although there were pernicious rumors that the president was in Wanamaker's pocket, Wanamaker's Washington House undoubtedly sent a strong message to both his colleagues and Congress about the role he believed European art and decorative objects should play in American life, both public and private. The transmission of this message was, moreover, not limited to Wanamaker's inner political circle. Wanamaker not only allowed Johnston to photograph and write about his home for a popular magazine, but also had her article reproduced in a book he commissioned during his time as Postmaster General. Called The Story of Our Post Office, it was written by his private secretary at the post office, Marshall Cushing, and distributed to Americans through agents and, unsurprisingly, department store book departments. Wanamaker's efforts to disseminate images of his house and his art collection to the larger public through official means are a clear case of his attempt not only to integrate himself into the history of the United States, but also a sense of cosmopolitan consumerism into the nation's homes and identities. Through Cushing's text, the average American could see how Wanamaker, one of the most influential men in America, lived. They could, moreover, copy to a degree his lifestyle. This is because engraved reproductions of the work of the artist on display in Wanamaker's own picture gallery could be bought in his store's art gallery in Philadelphia, or increasingly through department store catalogs. Like Wanamaker's paintings, these engravings marked their purchaser as worldly and cosmopolitan, even if, unlike Wanamaker, they had not or could not travel to Europe. Thus, although Wanamaker could not openly campaign against protectionism, his personal consumption of European art marked cosmopolitanism, both cultural and economic, as aspirational and, most importantly, wholly American. After his time as Postmaster General ended in 1892, Wanamaker returned to his retail business in Philadelphia, but this time without his art collection. The paintings that had hung in his Washington house, as well as his massive Munkachi canvases, were relocated to Lindenhurst, the Wanamaker family home in Montgomery County. There they stayed until a fire in February 1907 destroyed the house and a portion of the collection, which Wanamaker had added to greatly with old masterworks by the likes of Titian, Rubens, and Constable in the intervening years, although, as always, the veracity of the paintings and their attribution was always in question. Yet not only was the collection itself different, but when Wanamaker, after the fire, decided to move a large portion of it into his store, it was arguably in a much different context than if he had displayed it there 20 years earlier. For one, whereas both Wanamaker's commercial art gallery and his intended collection gallery were pioneering developments for department stores in the 1880s, by 1907 it was de rigueur for even smaller regional stores to sell and display fine art. The year 1907 was also the cusp of huge changes in the Republican Party's stance towards protectionist tariffs, with William Howard Taft, elected in 1908, openly pursuing, although not fully achieving, tariff reform. And crucially, it would only take another 4 years before, in the Tariff Act of 1913, the loathed art tariff was abolished altogether. It is apparent that major changes had taken place in the country's economy and culture in the 30 years since Wanamaker first opened the doors of the American department store to the display of fine art. American historians such as William Leach and Alan Trachtenberg have described exactly this period as a crucial turning point when American culture was commercialized, or, in other words, oriented around corporations and consumption. Leach, in Land of Desire, his seminal study of the period, even quickly alights on Wanamaker's display of art, citing it as a part of this shift by associating the act of viewing art with the act of consumption. Yet by focusing directly on the display and sale of art either in department stores or by those involved in department stores, new aspects and impacts of this history are revealed. For instance, while the glancing focused on the phenomenon of department store art display and many studies of 19th century America implies that it was a tool of secondary importance for department stores, it is clear from the history of Wanamaker's art collection and department store that he considered fine art beside even religion in its power to shape and mold his main market, which was America and its public. The centrality of art to Wanamaker's cultural and political endeavors, but more crucially, the centrality of Wanamaker to American society in this period, also raises questions about the relevance of Wanamaker's goals to other art collectors who went on to endow museums or open their collections. For instance, while the nature of Frick's business did not place him as close to the average consumer as Wanamaker's, the two still shared common business interests and views. Moreover, Frick would necessarily have had a direct concern for the developing culture of the country through its effect on the economy and labor practices. It is thus, in my opinion, not beyond reason to consider Wanamaker's pioneering efforts to expose everyday Americans to European art and foreign cultures, always, of course, controlling the message of such exposure, as at the forefront of the evolutions in art museums during the late 19th century. This is when these modern institutions of display progressively began to develop their roles as educators and gatekeepers of culture for all Americans. Wanamaker may not, like his counterparts Henry Clay Frick, Isabella Stewart Gardner, or even Marshall Field, have left a museum behind in his name, but his houses and stores were arguably museums in their own time. Holding the retailer and his enterprises as an example followed by other collectors, moreover, allows us to see the equally commercial and transactional roots of their collections, whether or not, like Wanamaker, they were directly involved in the business of selling goods to the American public. Thank you.